Dunkleosteus didn't have teeth, at least not the kind you've seen in museums. For more than a century, nearly every reconstruction showed the same animal, a giant armored predator. Long body, shark-like proportions, rows of enormous fangs waiting to snap shut on anything that crossed its path. It looked convincing. It looked terrifying. There was only one problem. Almost every part of it was wrong. Its size was wrong. Its body shape was wrong. Even the weapon that made it famous turned out to be something entirely different. And in 2023, a new study rebuilt Dunkleosteus using a method that had never been applied to it before. What emerged wasn't a smaller version of the monster everyone knew. It was something far stranger, and in many ways, even more dangerous. If you enjoy discovering the science before museums and textbooks catch up, subscribe. Every week we revisit famous prehistoric animals and compare what everyone believes with what the latest research actually shows. To understand why this discovery matters, we need to travel back roughly 360 million years. The world looked nothing like it does today. There were no dinosaurs, no birds, no mammals. Forests had only recently begun spreading across the continents, and the largest animals on land were primitive amphibians struggling to leave the water. Life's greatest battles happened beneath the surface. Warm, shallow seas covered enormous parts of the planet. Coral reefs stretched for hundreds of miles. Armored fish ruled the oceans. And among them lived one predator, unlike anything that would ever evolve again. Its fossils were first discovered in 1867 along the shores of Lake Erie in Ohio. Scientists eventually named it Dunkleosteus terrelli. Almost immediately, it became legendary, one of the earliest vertebrate apex predators ever known, an animal that seemed to dominate the Devonian oceans long before sharks became the rulers of the sea. But there was a problem. The fossils were incomplete. Researchers had magnificent skulls, powerful jaws, heavy armor, but almost nothing from the rest of the body. That missing information forced scientists to do what paleontology sometimes has no choice but to do. They estimated, for more than 150 years, those estimates settled into what appeared to be scientific fact. Dunkleosteus measured somewhere between 5 and 10 meters long. It had the streamlined body of a giant shark, and its jaws were lined with enormous teeth. Those three ideas appeared in documentaries, museum exhibits, children's books, scientific illustrations. Eventually they became so familiar that almost nobody questioned them anymore. But science isn't built on familiarity, it's built on evidence. And new evidence has a habit of changing old certainties. In February 2023, paleontologist Russell Engelman from Case Western Reserve University approached the problem from an entirely different direction. Instead of guessing the missing parts of the body, he asked a much simpler question. Could body size be predicted from measurements that almost every fossil actually preserved? To find out, he assembled one of the largest comparative datasets ever used for this group of ancient fish. More than 3,000 individual measurements, 972 living and extinct species. Rather than estimating body length from incomplete skeletons, he focused on a measurement called orbit opercular length, the distance between the eye socket and the opening behind the gill cover. Across species with complete skeletons, that single measurement proved remarkably reliable for predicting total body size. Only then did he apply the method to Dunkleosteus. The result surprised almost everyone. Typical adults weren't 6, or 8, or even 10 meters long. Most measured around 3.4 meters. The largest known individuals reached only about 4.1 meters. Not the size of a school bus, closer to the length of a large family car. At first, that sounds disappointing, until you hear what Engelman pointed out next. An 11-foot Dunkleosteus weighed about the same as a 15-foot great white shark. Think about that for a second. A much shorter animal, carrying almost exactly the same mass. That can only happen if the body is built very differently. Instead of being long and streamlined like a shark, Dunkleosteus was compact, deep-bodied, exceptionally broad. Its enormous armored head represented nearly 1/3 of its entire body length. It wasn't designed for speed across long distances. It was built like a battering ram, dense, powerful, almost unbelievably muscular. The size became smaller, but the danger didn't shrink at all. In fact, the new reconstruction suggested something even more unsettling. The museums hadn't made the animal less impressive. They had misunderstood what actually made it lethal. And that's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because the most terrifying part of Dunkleosteus wasn't its size. It wasn't even its armor. It was the fact that the weapon everyone remembers wasn't made of teeth at all. Exactly how dangerous? That's where the real surprise begins. Because everything we've talked about so far, its revised size, its compact body, its massive armored head, was only setting the stage. The feature that made Dunkleosteus famous for more than a century was also the feature almost everyone misunderstood. It didn't have teeth, not a single true tooth. Instead, it carried something far more unusual. Its jaws were built from thick, bony plates, not attached to the skull, not replacing teeth. They were part of the skull itself. As the animal grew, those plates grew with it, gradually forming long, razor-like cutting edges. Imagine your own jawbone slowly reshaping itself into a pair of sharpened blades. That's essentially what happened. The four prominent fangs seen in fossil skulls weren't teeth at all. They were extensions of living bone. Solid, massive, and unlike teeth, they never needed to be replaced, but the strangest part wasn't what they were made of. It was what happened every time the jaws closed. The upper blades slid directly against the lower blades, bone against bone, edge against edge. Every bite created friction, and that friction continuously polished the cutting surfaces. Think about that for a moment. Most cutting tools become dull with use. A kitchen knife needs sharpening. An animal's teeth gradually wear down. Dunkleosteus worked in exactly the opposite way. The more it used its weapon, the sharper it became. Imagine owning a knife that sharpened itself every time you sliced through something. That's the closest modern comparison. Evolution had created a self-maintaining cutting system hundreds of millions of years before humans ever forged steel. And because those blades were part of the skull, they couldn't fall out, they couldn't loosen, they couldn't be broken off and replaced one by one like shark teeth. The weapon remained permanently integrated into the head. One solid mechanical structure, simple, reliable, exceptionally strong. Type bone in the comments if you had no idea Dunkleosteus didn't actually have teeth. Or type new if you'd already heard about the bone blades, because once scientists understood what those blades really were. Another question immediately followed. How could an animal with no teeth generate enough force to dominate an entire ocean? The answer came years before the 2023 size revision. In 2007, researchers Philip Anderson and Mark Westneat at the University of Chicago built a detailed biomechanical model of the Dunkleosteus skull. Instead of asking how sharp the blades were, they asked how the entire head functioned. What they discovered was extraordinary. The jaw wasn't driven by a simple hinge. It behaved like an advanced mechanical linkage, a system remarkably similar to mechanisms engineers use in industrial cutting equipment. As powerful muscles contracted, several bones moved together in perfect sequence. The skull lifted, the lower jaw dropped, the mouth opened with astonishing speed, from fully closed to completely open, in roughly 1/50th of a second. That's faster than most prey could even begin to react. But speed wasn't the only advantage. Opening the jaws that quickly created a sudden drop in water pressure directly in front of the mouth. The effect was similar to suction. Nearby prey wasn't simply bitten, it was pulled inward. Imagine standing beside a powerful vacuum that suddenly switched on without warning. Before you even realized what happened, you'd already be moving toward it. That's essentially what many Devonian fish experienced. First, the suction pulled them closer. Then, the jaws snapped shut. And the bone blades did the rest. The estimated bite forces were astonishing. More than 4,400 newtons concentrated near the tips of the blades. Over 5,300 newtons along the cutting edges. Comparable to the bite of some of the largest crocodiles alive today, except this predator wasn't 20 feet long. It was roughly the size of a large automobile. Compact, armored, and built to deliver enormous force with terrifying efficiency. Then, in 2024, Russell Engelman published another study. This time, the focus wasn't body size, it was jaw anatomy. The new reconstruction suggested that Dunkleosteus may have been even more specialized for attacking large vertebrate prey than researchers previously believed. For years, many scientists favored the idea that it relied heavily on suction feeding. The revised anatomy tells a different story. Suction certainly helped bring prey within reach, but the real weapon wasn't suction, it was precision. The jaws weren't designed to crush shells like a modern gyrophagus fish. They were designed to slice, to shear, to drive sharpened bone through flesh and armor with incredible control. Every new study pushed the same conclusion a little further. Dunkleosteus wasn't simply a giant armored fish. It was a highly specialized killing machine unlike anything alive today. And when paleontologists examined the fossil record more closely, they discovered something even darker. It wasn't just hunting everything else in the Devonian Ocean. Sometimes, it hunted its own kind. For an apex predator, that isn't entirely surprising. What surprised scientists was the evidence. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't based on computer simulations. It was preserved in the fossils themselves. Several Dunkleosteus specimens carry deep cuts and puncture marks that perfectly match the shape and spacing of another Dunkleosteus jaw. The wounds healed, which means the animals survived the attacks. Others show damage that never healed at all. The conclusion is difficult to avoid. These predators sometimes attacked one another, whether over territory, food, or mating opportunities. We still don't know. But one thing is clear. The largest predator in the Devonian Ocean didn't recognize members of its own species as untouchable. If another Dunkleosteus was small enough, weak enough, or simply unlucky enough, it could become prey. Type armor if you'd like to see a future documentary exploring the entire Devonian ecosystem. Or type blades if you want a deep dive comparing Dunkleosteus's bone weapons with every other bite system in evolutionary history. Because those bone blades only tell half the story. The other half was the armor. Nothing alive today has anything quite like it. The front third of Dunkleosteus wasn't covered in scales. It wasn't protected by thick skin. It wasn't reinforced by cartilage. It was wrapped in massive plates of living bone. Solid dermal armor surrounded the skull, protected the brain, shielded the jaw muscles, enclosed the gill region, and extended across the upper torso. Some of those plates reached extraordinary thickness, much thicker than anything normally seen in modern fish. The front of the animal functioned almost like a biological tank. Everything vital was hidden behind a rigid protective shield. Meanwhile, the rear two-thirds of the body remained flexible, muscular, built entirely for propulsion. It was an unusual design. One section optimized for protection, the other optimized for movement. At first glance, those two goals seem impossible to combine. Heavy armor usually reduces mobility, but evolution solved the problem in an unexpected way. Because the armor wasn't simply protecting the head, it actually became part of the feeding mechanism itself. Modern fish usually open their mouths by lowering the lower jaw. Dunkleosteus couldn't rely on that strategy. Its massive armor limited that movement. So evolution found another solution. Instead of only lowering the jaw, it raised the entire skull. The armored head rotated upward at a specialized joint, connecting the head shield to the thoracic armor. At exactly the same moment, the lower jaw rotated downward. Both movements happened together. The result was extraordinary. The mouth opened far wider than its size alone would suggest. Large prey could enter the jaws with remarkable efficiency. Then the head rotated back into place. The bone blades met, and the cut was complete. In other words, the same armor that protected the predator also powered its attack. Protection became mechanics. Mechanics became weaponry. Very few animals in evolutionary history have combined those functions so elegantly. For more than 20 million years, that design worked. Dunkleosteus dominated the Devonian seas long before sharks became the rulers of the oceans. No other known vertebrate predator of its time combined armor, speed, and cutting power in quite the same way. It occupied the top of the food chain across one of the richest marine ecosystems Earth has ever produced. Then, Everything changed. Near the end of the Devonian period, Earth experienced one of the 5 great mass extinctions. Ocean chemistry shifted, marine ecosystems collapsed, entire evolutionary lineages disappeared. Among them, every known placoderm, not just Dunkleosteus, all of them, millions of years of evolutionary success, erased. The oceans didn't become empty. Other predators survived. Primitive sharks, early cartilaginous fishes, animals with true teeth instead of sharpened bone. They inherited the role once held by Dunkleosteus, not necessarily because they were better hunters. There's little evidence to suggest they were. They simply survived an extinction event that the armored fishes could not. Sometimes, evolution doesn't reward perfection, it rewards resilience, and survival isn't always decided by who dominates an ecosystem. Sometimes it's decided by who can endure the day that ecosystem disappears. When most people imagine the first great predator in Earth's history, they picture an oversized shark, long, fast, covered in teeth. That's the image museums helped create for generations. But the real animal was something entirely different. Shorter, heavier, armored from head to chest, equipped not with teeth, but with self-sharpening blades made from its own skull. It wasn't simply another giant fish, it was one of evolution's boldest experiments. A predator built around an idea that has never been repeated in quite the same way. For more than 20 million years, Dunkleosteus proved that a heavily armored vertebrate could dominate an entire ocean. Long before giant sharks, long before marine reptiles, long before whales, it demonstrated that Earth's oceans could support specialized apex predators on an enormous scale. Every great marine hunter that evolved afterward inherited an ecological role that animals like Dunkleosteus had already established hundreds of millions of years earlier. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of this story. The fossils themselves never lied. The skulls were always there. The armor was always there. The bone blades were always there. What changed was the way we learned to read them. New measurements replaced old assumptions. New biomechanics replaced artistic interpretation, and one of the most familiar prehistoric predators quietly became a completely different animal. Not because the fossils changed, because science did. That's how paleontology moves forward, not by protecting old ideas, but by testing them against better evidence. Every new discovery has the power to rewrite something we thought was settled. Sometimes it's the size of an animal. Sometimes it's the way it hunted. Sometimes it's the weapon everyone thought they understood. Dunkleosteus reminds us that even the most iconic museum reconstruction is still a hypothesis, a snapshot of what scientists knew at that moment, and every new generation of research has the opportunity to sharpen that picture. Just as the animal sharpened its own jaws every time it bit. If you enjoy discovering the science before museums and textbooks catch up, subscribe and join us each week as we revisit prehistoric life through the newest evidence and the latest research. Because the most fascinating stories in natural history aren't always about discovering new fossils. Sometimes, they're about realizing we've been looking at the same fossils the wrong way all along. In our next documentary, we'll travel even farther back in time to meet an animal that appears in almost every dinosaur toy collection, despite never living alongside the dinosaurs. It carried a giant sail across its back, dominated a world long before the age of reptiles, and was more closely related to you than to any dinosaur that would ever exist. Until then, remember this: Dunkleosteus didn't need teeth. It had something evolution had never built before, and never built again.